I was standing in my driveway on a bright Tuesday morning in Mesa, Arizona, when I noticed my brand new pressure washer setup was missing from where I had left it the night before. The commercial-grade Simpson pressure washer, the extension wands, the surface cleaner attachment, the chemical injector, and all the accessories I had spent over $2,000 on were just gone. My name is Zachary Aldridge, and I had moved into this Suncrest Hills community 6 months ago, thinking I had found the perfect place to settle down after my divorce. The house was beautiful, the neighborhood seemed quiet, and I was finally starting to feel like I could rebuild my life. But that morning marked the beginning of what would become the most absurd and infuriating situation I had ever experienced. I stood there for a solid minute, just staring at the empty spot against my garage wall. I knew I had locked everything up properly because I am meticulous about my tools and equipment. I work as an independent contractor specializing in exterior home cleaning and maintenance, so that pressure washer was not just a hobby item but essential to my livelihood. My heart was pounding as I walked around the side of my house, checking to see if maybe I had moved it and forgotten, even though I knew that was impossible. That is when I heard the unmistakable sound of a pressure washer running. It was coming from 2 houses down, from the direction of the HOA president's house. Karen Whitmore lived there, a woman in her late 40s with bleached blonde hair that she wore in that aggressive bob cut that seemed to be the uniform of neighborhood busybodies everywhere. I had only interacted with her a handful of times since moving in, and each interaction had left me with a bad taste in my mouth. She had complained about my truck being parked in my own driveway, about the color of my front door, about my lawn furniture, and about pretty much everything else she could think of. I walked down the sidewalk toward the sound, my anger building with each step. As I rounded the corner into her driveway, I could not believe what I was seeing. There was Karen, wearing expensive athleisure wear and oversized sunglasses, using my pressure washer to clean her driveway. I could see my exact setup, right down to the custom decal I had put on the side of the machine with my business logo. "That's my pressure washer," I said loudly, trying to keep my voice steady. Karen turned off the machine and looked at me with this expression of complete disdain. "Excuse me. This is HOA property. We confiscated it because you were storing equipment in violation of the community guidelines." I felt my jaw drop. "What are you talking about? That's my personal property. I bought it with my own money. You cannot just take someone's belongings." She pulled out her phone and started tapping on it. According to Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws, all equipment must be stored inside garages or in approved storage structures. Your pressure washer was visible from the street, which constitutes a violation. We have the right to confiscate items that violate community standards. It was against my garage wall, barely visible, and even if it was a violation, you cannot just steal my property. "That is theft," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Karen put her phone away and crossed her arms. "I am the HOA president, Zachary. I suggest you review the bylaws you agreed to when you purchased your home. You can submit a formal complaint if you disagree with my decision, but the equipment stays with me until the board meeting next month." I could not believe what I was hearing. "I need that equipment for work. I have jobs scheduled. You have to give it back." "Should have thought about that before breaking the rules," she said. And then she actually turned the pressure washer back on and went back to cleaning her driveway with my equipment. I stood there for another moment, absolutely furious, and then I pulled out my phone and called the Mesa Police Department. I explained the situation to the dispatcher, who told me they would send an officer out to make a report. I walked back to my house to wait, watching from my front window as Karen continued to use my pressure washer like she owned it. Officer Rodriguez arrived about 20 minutes later. He was a stocky guy in his 30s with a professional demeanor. I explained the entire situation to him, showed him my receipts and proof of purchase on my phone, and then we walked together down to Karen's house. She was still in her driveway, having moved on to washing down her patio furniture. When she saw us approaching, she turned off the machine again, but this time her expression was less confident. "Madam, I am Officer Rodriguez with Mesa PD. I understand there is a dispute about this pressure washer," he said. Karen launched into her explanation about HOA bylaws and violations and her authority as president. Officer Rodriguez listened patiently, and then he asked to see the specific bylaw she was referencing. She pulled it up on her phone and showed him. He read it carefully, and then he shook his head. "Madam, even if there was a violation, the HOA does not have the authority to confiscate personal property. You would need to go through the proper legal channels, which would involve written warnings, fines, and potentially a civil lawsuit. You cannot just take someone's belongings. That is theft." Karen's face turned red. "I am the HOA president. I have the authority to enforce community standards. You have the authority to issue warnings and fines, not to take property. I need you to return this equipment to Mr. Aldridge immediately," Officer Rodriguez said firmly. I could see Karen calculating something in her head. Finally, she said, "Fine, take it, but you will be receiving a formal violation notice and a fine." I started disconnecting my equipment and loading it into my truck, which I had driven down the street. Officer Rodriguez stayed to make sure everything was returned, and he wrote up a report documenting the incident. As he was finishing up, he mentioned something that caught my attention. "Madam, I see here that you have several prior incidents on file. I would strongly advise you to familiarize yourself with property law before taking any further actions like this." Karen did not respond, just glared at both of us. I thanked Officer Rodriguez profusely, got all my equipment back to my house, and thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 3 days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Inside was a violation notice claiming I had multiple infractions, including the visible storage of equipment, an unapproved paint color on my front door, violations of landscaping requirements, and improper parking of a commercial vehicle. Each violation came with a $200 fine, totaling $1,200. I was absolutely livid. I immediately started researching. I pulled out my original HOA documents from when I bought the house. I went through every single page of the bylaws. My front door was the exact same color it had been when I bought the house, which meant it had already been approved. My landscaping was identical to at least a dozen other houses in the neighborhood. My truck was a standard pickup that I used for work, and there was nothing in the bylaws about commercial vehicles as long as they were not big rigs or had massive company logos plastered all over them. I drafted a detailed response letter, citing specific sections of the bylaws and including photographic evidence of other homes with similar features. I sent it via certified mail and emailed a copy to the HOA board email address. I also started asking around the neighborhood, talking to other homeowners about their experiences with Karen. What I discovered was shocking. Karen had been HOA president for 3 years, and during that time, she had made enemies of at least half the neighborhood. I spoke with my next-door neighbor, Greg, who told me that Karen had fined him repeatedly for having the wrong shade of beige on his house, even though his house had been professionally painted using colors from the approved palette. I talked to Sandra, who lived across the street, and she said Karen had tried to force her to remove a vegetable garden from her backyard, claiming it violated aesthetic standards, even though it was not visible from any street or common area. The more people I talked to, the more I realized that Karen had been abusing her position for years. Several homeowners mentioned that they had tried to vote her out, but she controlled the board meetings and had stacked the board with her friends. One elderly couple told me they were considering selling their house just to get away from the constant harassment. I decided to fight back. I contacted an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Her name was Deanna O'Connor, and she had a reputation for not backing down. I met with her in her office in downtown Mesa, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Diana listened to my story, reviewed all my documentation, and nodded thoughtfully. "You have a strong case. What Karen did constitutes theft, and these fines are clearly retaliatory and baseless. We can fight this, but I want you to understand that HOA disputes can get ugly. Are you prepared for that? She stole my equipment and is trying to fine me over $1,000 for made-up violations." "I am already in the ugly part," I said. Deanna smiled. "Fair enough. Let me draft a response and we will see where this goes. I am also going to do some digging into the HOA's records. If Karen has been doing this to multiple homeowners, there might be grounds for a larger action." Over the next 2 weeks, Deanna sent several letters to the HOA board, demanding they withdraw the fines and provide documentation for their claims. The HOA, or rather Karen, responded with increasingly hostile letters, refusing to back down. Deanna then filed a lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court, seeking to have the fines dismissed and requesting damages for the theft of my property and harassment. That is when things escalated in a way I never could have predicted. One morning, about a week after the lawsuit was filed, I woke up to find that my front lawn had been destroyed. Someone had spray-painted profanities all over my driveway and the front of my garage. My mailbox had been knocked over. I immediately called the police again. This time, Officer Martinez responded. She was younger than Rodriguez, maybe late 20s, with sharp eyes that took in every detail. She photographed everything, and then she asked me if I had any security cameras. I did not, but I mentioned that several of my neighbors did. She went door to door, and within an hour, she had footage from Greg's camera showing a figure in dark clothing vandalizing my property at around 3 in the morning. The footage was not clear enough to make a positive identification, but the person's build and movements were consistent with a woman. Officer Martinez told me she would investigate further. I spent the rest of that day cleaning up the mess and getting estimates for lawn repair. The damage was going to cost me close to $3,000. Diana was furious when I told her. She immediately filed for a restraining order against Karen and added the vandalism to our civil lawsuit. The court date for the restraining order was set for 2 weeks out. In the meantime, I installed a comprehensive security camera system around my entire property. If Karen or anyone else tried something again, I would have clear evidence. 3 days before the restraining order hearing, I got a call from Officer Martinez. She asked me to come down to the station. When I arrived, she led me into a small interview room and showed me something on her computer. They had enhanced the footage from Greg's camera and had also obtained footage from a camera at a house across the street. By combining the 2 angles and using some software magic I did not fully understand, they had been able to get a partial view of the vandal's face. It was definitely a woman, and while the image was grainy, it looked an awful lot like Karen. "We need more evidence to make an arrest," Officer Martinez explained. "But I wanted you to see this. We are also pulling records on Miss Whitmore. There have been multiple complaints filed against her over the years, Most were civil matters, but there are a few that caught our attention. She pulled up a file on her computer. Karen had been arrested twice before, once for disorderly conduct at a school board meeting and once for assault, after she allegedly pushed another woman during an argument at a grocery store. Both charges had been dropped or pled down to minor infractions, but they established a pattern of aggressive behavior. "There is more," Officer Martinez said. "We found out that Miss Whitmore has been involved in at least 9 documented incidents where she was accused of theft, harassment, or property damage. Most victims chose not to pursue charges, likely because of the cost and hassle of litigation. But if this vandalism was her, this would be her 10th documented offense." I felt a chill run down my spine. What happens if she has 10 offenses? Depends on the severity and what a judge decides, but it could mean serious consequences, especially if there is a pattern of escalating behavior. Also, we discovered that Miss Whitmore is in a custody dispute over her 2 children. Her ex-husband has been trying to get full custody, and incidents like this could significantly impact that case. The restraining order hearing arrived. I showed up with Deanna, and we had all our documentation organized and ready. Karen showed up with her own attorney, a nervous-looking man in his 50s who kept wiping sweat from his forehead. The hearing was in front of Judge Patricia Hendricks, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had a reputation for being fair but strict. Diana presented our case methodically. She showed the police report from the theft of my pressure washer, the documentation of the baseless fines, the evidence of vandalism, and the enhanced security footage. Karen's attorney tried to argue that there was no definitive proof that Karen was responsible for the vandalism, and that the other incidents were simply HOA business. Judge Hendricks was not buying it. She reviewed all the evidence carefully, and then she asked Karen directly, "Miss Whitmore, did you take Mr. Aldridge's pressure washer from his property?" Karen hesitated and then said, "I confiscated equipment that was in violation of HOA bylaws." "That is not what I asked. Did you take property that belonged to Mr. Aldridge without his permission?" "I had the authority as HOA president to enforce community standards." Judge Hendricks leaned forward. "Miss Whitmore, I am going to ask you one more time, and I expect a yes or no answer. Did you take Mr. Aldridge's property without his permission?" Karen's face was bright red. "Yes, but it was within my authority." "No, it was not. The HOA bylaws do not grant you the right to confiscate personal property. That is theft, regardless of your position. I am granting the restraining order. You are to stay at least 100 yards away from Mr. Aldridge and his property. You are not to contact him directly or indirectly. Do you understand?" Karen looked like she wanted to argue, but her attorney put a hand on her arm. "Yes, Your Honor," she said through gritted teeth. As we were leaving the courthouse, Deanna pulled me aside. "This is good, but be careful. Women like Karen do not like being told no. She might try something else." Deanna was right. 2 days later, I received notice that the HOA was filing a lawsuit against me for failure to pay fines and for violating community standards. It was clearly retaliation, but it meant more legal fees and more hassle. Deanna assured me that we would countersue and that Karen was digging her own grave, but I was exhausted by the whole situation. Then, exactly 1 week after the restraining order was granted, my security cameras caught Karen red-handed. It was just after midnight on a Saturday. I was asleep when my phone started buzzing with alerts from my security system. I grabbed my phone and pulled up the camera feed. There was Karen, standing in my driveway, holding a can of spray paint. She was looking directly at my garage door, clearly about to vandalize my property again. I immediately called 911 and told them, I had an active trespasser violating a restraining order. I stayed on the line and watched through my camera as Karen spray painted something on my garage door. Within 5 minutes, I heard sirens. Karen tried to run, but she was not fast enough. 2 police cars pulled up and officers jumped out. I watched from my bedroom window as they detained her. I went outside, still in my pajamas, and spoke with the officers. They had caught Karen with the spray paint can still in her hand, and my cameras had captured everything in crystal clear high-definition video. She was arrested on the spot for violating the restraining order, trespassing, and vandalism. As they put her in the back of the patrol car, I could see her screaming something, but I could not make out the words. Officer Martinez arrived a little while later to take my statement. "Mr. Aldridge, this is the 10th documented offense we have on Miss Whitmore. Combined with the violation of a court order, she is in serious trouble. The district attorney is going to want to prosecute this aggressively." Over the next few days, I learned more about Karen's situation. Her ex-husband, Robert, reached out to me through Deanna. He wanted to thank me because my case had given him the evidence he needed in his custody battle. He explained that he had been trying for 2 years to get full custody of their 2 children, ages 8 and 11. He had documented Karen's erratic and aggressive behavior, but judges often favored keeping children with their mothers unless there was clear evidence of unfitness. "The arrest and the pattern of behavior you helped establish is exactly what I needed," Robert told me over the phone. His voice was thick with emotion. "My kids have been living in fear of her mood swings and outbursts. She is not violent with them, but she is controlling and emotionally abusive. Having this documented pattern of criminal behavior is going to make all the difference." I felt a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I never intended to get involved in someone's custody dispute. On the other hand, if Karen was treating her own children the way she had treated me and other neighbors, maybe they were better off with their father. The criminal case moved forward quickly. Karen was released on bail, but with strict conditions. She was not allowed to contact me or go anywhere near my property. She was also not allowed to attend any HOA meetings or perform any duties as HOA president pending the resolution of her case. The HOA board, finally freed from her control, held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove her as president and install an interim president while they investigated her conduct. I attended that meeting, and it was cathartic. Homeowner after homeowner stood up and shared their stories of harassment, baseless fines, and abuse of power. One man broke down in tears talking about how Karen had fined him repeatedly while he was caring for his dying wife, adding financial stress to an already impossible situation. The new interim president, a retired schoolteacher named Margaret, apologized on behalf of the board and promised a full review of all fines issued during Karen's tenure. Diana's civil lawsuit also moved forward. We were suing Karen personally, not the HOA, for theft, harassment, and property damage. The evidence was overwhelming, and Karen's own attorney advised her to settle. After several rounds of negotiation, she agreed to pay me $25,000 in damages, which covered all my legal fees, the cost of the vandalism repairs, lost business income, and emotional distress. The HOA also officially rescinded all the fines she had issued against me and issued a written apology. But the most significant developments were happening in criminal court and family court. The district attorney charged Karen with multiple counts of criminal trespass, vandalism, theft, and violation of a court order. Because this was her 10th documented offense, and because she had violated a restraining order, The prosecutor was pushing for jail time rather than just probation or fines. Meanwhile, in family court, Robert's attorney used all the evidence from my case to demonstrate a pattern of criminal behavior and poor judgment. Deanna testified as a witness, explaining how Karen had abused her position and harassed multiple homeowners. Officer Martinez testified about the arrests and the documented pattern of escalating behavior. The security footage of Karen vandalizing my property at midnight was played in court, showing her complete disregard for the law and court orders. I attended the custody hearing at Robert's request. He wanted me there for support, and I felt obligated to see it through. The courtroom was tense. Karen sat with her attorney, looking smaller and more defeated than I had ever seen her. Her bleached blonde hair looked unkempt, and she had dark circles under her eyes. On the other side of the room, Robert sat with his two children, a boy and a girl who looked nervous but hopeful. The judge in the custody case was Judge Michael Torres, a man in his 50s with a reputation for putting children's welfare above all else. He listened to testimony from both sides, reviewed all the evidence, and then he spoke directly to Karen's children. He asked them how they felt living with their mother, whether they felt safe, and what they wanted. The children were honest in a way that broke my heart. They loved their mother, but they were afraid of her anger and her unpredictability. They wanted to live with their father. Judge Torres made his ruling from the bench. Miss Whitmore, I have reviewed extensive evidence of a pattern of criminal behavior, poor judgment, and disregard for authority and court orders. While your children love you, their welfare must be my primary concern. I am granting full physical and legal custody to Mr. Robert Whitmore. You will be allowed supervised visitation once every 2 weeks, pending completion of an anger management program and a psychological evaluation. If you complete these programs and demonstrate consistent behavioral improvement over a period of at least 1 year, we can revisit the custody arrangement. Until then, the children will live with their father. Karen stood up and started shouting at the judge. Her attorney tried to pull her back down, but she was hysterical. You cannot take my children. I am their mother. This is not fair. Security had to escort her from the courtroom while Robert held his crying children. I left the courthouse feeling emotionally drained. I had moved to Mesa to start over, to build a quiet life for myself. Instead, I had gotten caught up in one woman's campaign of harassment that had ultimately cost her everything. But as I drove home, I realized that maybe it was not my fault. Karen had made her choices. She had decided to steal my property, to harass me and countless others, to violate a court order, to prioritize her need for control over the well-being of her own children. Those were her decisions, not mine. The criminal trial happened 2 months later. I testified about the theft of my pressure washer and the vandalism. The prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including testimony from other homeowners about Karen's pattern of behavior. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. At sentencing, the judge took into account Karen's prior offenses, the violation of a restraining order, and the impact on the community. He sentenced her to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation. He also ordered her to continue with anger management therapy and to pay restitution to all the victims of her harassment. I was in the courtroom when the sentence was read. Karen did not react at first. She just sat there, staring straight ahead. Then, as the reality sank in, she started to cry. Not the angry, manipulative tears I had seen before, but genuine sobs of someone who had lost everything and finally understood the magnitude of her mistakes. After the sentencing, Robert approached me in the courthouse hallway. His children were not with him this time. "I want to thank you again," he said. "I know none of this was easy for you, but you gave my kids a chance at a normal life. They are doing so much better already. They are laughing again, playing with friends, actually being kids." "I am glad they are okay," I said. "I never wanted any of this to happen, but if some good came out of it, then maybe it was worth it." Robert shook my hand and then he left. I stood in that courthouse hallway for a few minutes, processing everything that had happened over the past few months. My life had been turned upside down because one woman thought she had the right to control everyone around her. But in the end, the system had worked. Justice had been served, and people who had been suffering under Karen's tyranny were finally free. I drove home to my house in Suncrest Hills. The neighborhood felt different now. People actually waved to me when I drove by. Several neighbors had apologized for not standing up to Karen sooner. The new HOA board was working hard to undo the damage she had caused, refunding improper fines and updating the bylaws to include better checks and balances. My lawn had been repaired, my garage had been repainted, and my pressure washer was safely locked in my garage. I had even gotten a few new clients from the publicity around the case. Several people in Mesa had heard about the situation and specifically sought out my services because they admired how I had stood up to the abuse. Life slowly returned to normal over the following months. The HOA operated smoothly under new leadership. Margaret, the interim president, turned out to be excellent at the job. She was fair, reasonable, and actually cared about making the community a better place rather than just wielding power. The board voted to make her permanent president, and under her guidance, Suncrest Hills became the kind of neighborhood I had hoped for when I first moved in. I heard through Robert that Karen was struggling in jail. She had gotten into several altercations with other inmates and had been placed in isolation multiple times. Her supervised visits with her children were not going well. The kids were polite but distant, and it was clear that the relationship was badly damaged. Robert was hopeful that eventually, with proper therapy and genuine change, Karen might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship with her children. But he was not holding his breath for me. The whole experience taught me some important lessons. I learned that bullies often continue their behavior until someone stands up to them. I learned that documentation and evidence are crucial when dealing with harassment. I learned that the legal system, while slow and frustrating, can work when you have patience and good representation. And I learned that sometimes the worst experiences can lead to unexpected positive outcomes. Diana became a friend during the process. We would grab coffee occasionally and talk about life, not just legal matters. She told me that my case had inspired several other homeowners in different communities to stand up to abusive HOA leaders. She had taken on 3 new cases based on referrals from people who heard about what happened in Suncrest Hills. A year after Karen's arrest, I was sitting on my front porch on a Sunday afternoon, enjoying the Arizona sunshine and working on my laptop. A car pulled up, and I saw Robert get out with his 2 children. They walked up my driveway, and Robert smiled at me. "Hope you do not mind us stopping by unannounced," he said. "The kids wanted to meet you properly and say thank you." The little girl, whose name was Emma, handed me a drawing she had made. It showed a house with a family standing in front of it, all smiling. "This is our new family," she said. "Dad says you helped make it possible." Her brother Jake was more reserved, but he shook my hand and said, "Thank you for standing up to Mom. Things are a lot better now." I felt tears prick my eyes. "You are both very welcome. I am really glad you are happy." We talked for a while on my porch. Robert told me that the kids were thriving. Their grades had improved, they had joined sports teams and after-school activities, and they were seeing a therapist who was helping them process everything that had happened. He also mentioned that Karen had written them letters from jail, apologizing and trying to explain herself. The kids were not ready to respond yet, but maybe someday they would be. After they left, I sat back down on my porch and thought about how strange life could be. 6 months ago, I had been standing in my driveway, furious that my pressure washer had been stolen. That single incident had set off a chain of events that had exposed a pattern of abuse, led to criminal prosecution, resulted in a child custody change, and ultimately made a neighborhood a better place to live. It had cost me time, money, and a lot of stress, but looking back, I would not change how I handled it. The sun was setting over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. My phone buzzed with a notification about a new client wanting an estimate for a pressure washing job. I smiled and made a note to call them back tomorrow. Life was good. The neighborhood was peaceful. And I had learned that sometimes, standing up for what is right, even when it is difficult and messy, is absolutely worth it. Karen remained in jail for the full 18 months of her sentence. I heard from Robert occasionally with updates. She completed an anger management program and started therapy, but her progress was inconsistent. Some weeks she seemed genuinely remorseful and committed to change. Other weeks she would blame everyone else for her situation and insist she had been treated unfairly. When she was finally released, she moved to a different part of Arizona, somewhere near Tucson. She was not allowed to return to Mesa as part of her probation conditions, and the restraining order remained in effect. Her supervised visits with her children continued, but according to Robert, the relationship remained strained. Emma and Jake were cordial but guarded. They had built a life with their father, and Karen was increasingly becoming a peripheral figure in their lives rather than a central one. The HOA drama became something of a legend in Mesa. I would occasionally run into people at the hardware store or at local restaurants who recognized me from the news coverage. Most were supportive and shared their own HOA horror stories. A few people criticized me for not trying harder to resolve things peacefully, but I stood by my decisions. I had tried to be reasonable. I had followed proper procedures. Karen was the one who chose to escalate at every turn. 2 years after the initial theft of my pressure washer, I attended a neighborhood block party. It was a warm spring evening, and the entire community had turned out. There were kids playing in the street, families grilling food, and neighbors actually talking to each other and enjoying themselves. Margaret, the HOA president, gave a short speech thanking everyone for their patience during the transition and celebrating how far the community had come. As I stood there with a plate of barbecue in my hand, talking with Greg and Sandra and other neighbors who had become genuine friends, I realized that this was what community was supposed to be. Not rigid rules enforced by petty tyrants, but people coming together, respecting each other, and working through disagreements like adults. The whole experience with Karen had been painful, but it had forced Suncrest Hills to examine itself and make real changes. My business continued to thrive. The publicity from the case had brought in more clients than I could handle on my own, so I hired 2 employees and eventually bought a second pressure washer setup and a bigger truck. The kid who had moved to Arizona to escape a bad divorce and start over had built something real and successful. Every time I pulled that original pressure washer out of my garage to go to a job, I thought about how it had all started. Something so simple, a stolen piece of equipment, had changed so many lives. I never saw Karen again in person. Occasionally, I would wonder how she was doing, whether she had genuinely changed or whether she was just better at hiding her behavior. I hoped for her children's sake that she had found some peace and learned from her mistakes. But I also knew that some people never change, and that was not my responsibility. The legal settlement money from Karen went toward a down payment on a small commercial property where I could store my equipment and run my business. Deanna helped me with the paperwork, and we celebrated with dinner when the deal closed. She told me she was proud of how I had handled everything, from the initial theft to the final resolution. "A lot of people would have just given up," she said. "You saw it through and you made a real difference." As I locked up my new commercial space that night and drove home through the quiet streets of Mesa, I felt genuinely content. The journey from that Tuesday morning when I discovered my pressure washer missing to this moment had been long and difficult. There had been moments when I wanted to just let it go, to pay the fines and move on to avoid the conflict. But I had chosen to stand up for myself and for what was right, and that choice had led to justice not just for me, but for an entire community. Karen's story became a cautionary tale, not just in Suncrest Hills, but in HOA communities across Arizona. Several HOA management companies used it as a training example of what not to do and how unchecked power can lead to abuse. Lawyers like Deanna cited it in other cases to demonstrate the importance of proper procedures and respect for homeowners' rights. And for the families who had suffered under Karen's reign, it provided validation that they were not crazy, that the treatment they had endured was wrong, and that speaking up could lead to change. I still live in Suncrest Hills. My house is well maintained, my business is successful, and my neighbors are friends rather than adversaries. The HOA operates efficiently under Margaret's leadership, handling legitimate issues while respecting homeowners' rights and privacy. Violations are handled with warnings and reasonable fines, not with property theft and harassment. The neighborhood has become what it should have been all along. Sometimes on quiet evenings, I sit on my porch and think about the whole saga. How a simple act of theft led to a woman losing custody of her children forever and spending time in jail for her 10th offense. How my refusal to be bullied had exposed a pattern of abuse that had been hurting dozens of families. How justice, while sometimes slow, had ultimately prevailed. And how standing up for yourself, even when it is hard and scary and expensive, is always worth it. The pressure washer that started it all still works perfectly. It sits in my garage, maintained meticulously, a reminder of where I have been and what I have overcome. Every time I load it into my truck for a job, I remember that morning when it was missing, the anger and frustration I felt, and the long journey that followed. And I am grateful for every difficult moment, because those moments shaped me into someone stronger, someone who knows how to stand up for what is right, and someone who understands that one person speaking up can make a difference. Karen lost everything because she could not control her need to control others. Her children, her position, her freedom, and her reputation were all sacrificed on the altar of her ego. It is a tragedy in many ways, but it is also a lesson. Power without accountability leads to abuse. Abuse without consequences leads to escalation, and escalation without intervention leads to destruction. For me, the story has a happy ending. I have a home I love, a business that is thriving, a community that supports me, and the knowledge that I did the right thing even when it was difficult. The theft of my pressure washer could have been just an annoying incident that I let go. Instead, it became a catalyst for change that improved dozens of lives. And that, more than anything else, makes the whole ordeal worthwhile. Robert sends me Christmas cards every year now with pictures of Emma and Jake. They are growing up healthy and happy, involved in school activities and sports, surrounded by friends and family. In the most recent card, Jake had written a personal note thanking me again for helping them. He is a teenager now, old enough to understand what happened and to appreciate how different his life might have been if Karen had retained custody. That note sits on my desk, a reminder of why standing up to bullies matters. Life in Mesa continues. The desert sun rises and sets. The seasons change in subtle Arizona ways. My business grows. My friendships deepen. And every single day, I am grateful for that Tuesday morning when I discovered my pressure washer missing, because it set me on a path that led to justice, to community, and to becoming the person I was meant to be. Karen's attempt to control and dominate ultimately freed everyone from her tyranny, including, perhaps eventually, herself. And in the end, that is the best possible outcome for everyone involved.